Welcome everybody, my name's Emma Cave and I'm a Professor of Law at Durham University, and I'm one of the hosts of this webinar series, which is part of a British Academy COVID-19 project on ethics committees and ethical advice in the pandemic. The PI of the project is Dave Archard of Queen's University Belfast, who's also chair of the Nuffield Council of Bioethics and was waving just then. He's going to take over the chairing later on in the webinar. We also have our fantastic RA here, who's Mariana Ditborn, and she's looking after the technical side of things for us. So this is our second webinar in a series, and this one is going to focus on professional guidance. The first one focused on the national response, and the next one, which is in December, is going to look at clinical ethics committees, and you'll all be very, very welcome to come along then too. The webinar is going to take the form of 4 short talks. And after each one of those talks, we'll invite responses from our panelists. And then at the end of all of those 4 talks, we'll take questions that have been posed by you, our audience, through the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. I'm sure you're getting very used to this, as I know that many people have attended lots of webinars by now. So please do write questions that you think up as we go along. And when you do so, please make clear your name, but also the name of the speaker to whom your question is directed. And then we can pick those up towards the end of the webinar. So what I want to do now is introduce our 4 speakers, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, which will be Dominic Wilkinson, who is a neonatal intensivist and a professor of medical ethics at Oxford. Dominic writes very widely on critical care, research ethics, and has also written really excellent commentaries on some of the most pressing ethical issues related to COVID-19. So Dominic's going to start us off and is going to focus on the triage guidance in the first wave. The next speaker will be Katie Gallop, QC, a specialist in healthcare law from Sergeants in Chambers. Katie took Silk in 2016 and has been instructed in a number of important public inquiries. And she's also taken the time to give fantastic and inspiring lectures to students, including my own at Durham University. In the first wave, Katie and colleagues wrote an influential blog on the need for national policy on allocation and withdrawal of ventilation. Our third speaker will be Richard Huxtable, who is Professor of Medical Ethics at the Centre for Ethics of Medicine at Bristol. In addition to running an important project on best interest, Richard's also a board member of the UK Clinical Ethics Network. Richard's a leading expert on clinical ethics support, and we're really glad to welcome him here today. And then our 4th speaker is Mark Sheehan, who's an ethics fellow at the Ethox Centre at Oxford, and he's also a National Research Ethics Advisor for the National Research Ethics Service, along with a vast string of other accolades in relation to both research ethics and public health ethics. So welcome to all of our speakers, and welcome to you, our audience. We've invited the speakers to talk briefly about their reflections on professional guidance in the pandemic. And we hope to keep this fairly informal by allowing our panellists to reflect after each of the talks on areas of consensus as well as any differing perspectives. As I've mentioned, you, the audience, you can also set out your questions using the Q&A function. But do please remember to state your name and also the name of the person the question's for, because this will help us when it comes to the Q&A at the end of the session, work out who to direct the questions to. Okay, so thank you so much for coming. It now falls to me to invite Dominic, please, to share your screen and begin your talk. Thanks.
Great. Well, I'm hoping that my microphone is on and working. I've got a thumbs up. That's always a good sign. Thank you very much for the invitation, Emma and Dave. It's a great privilege to be able to be part of this webinar today. Unfortunately, I can't see you all out there, but I'm hoping that I can see that there's 60 or so of you out there, and I hope this is going to be interesting for you. I'm going to focus on a very kind of focused element of the ethical guidance offered during the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm sure there'll be other elements of guidance that will be discussed in the rest of the webinar, but I want to focus specifically on the question of triage guidance, and I'm going to think about an ethical evaluation of the triage guidance as was and as might have been. Um, so I'm going to, over the next 15 minutes or so, if I can keep time, have a think about why there was need for guidance. We'll talk about which guidance in particular I'm going to talk about. I'm going to identify 3 challenges or problems that clinicians faced, or that might have faced with the related to those guidelines. And then in the last part of the talk, I'm going to suggest some answers, because I think ethics is also about providing answers as well as identifying questions. So I'm going to suggest some answers to the questions that I had and others had about some of the potential guidance that might have been in use. Okay, so the first and kind of obvious question is what was the need for guidance? Well, just dialing back, it now seems like a long time ago, but at the beginning, 6 months ago, beginning of the pandemic, as the pandemic hit Europe, first half of March in particular, all of us in the UK were looking at these daily headlines from particularly northern Italy, the really distressing and striking pictures that were coming from intensive care units, from the wards in Italian hospitals, and the very powerful and passionate testimony of clinicians who felt that their health system, which is a well-resourced health system, indeed better resourced in some ways than the NHS in terms of intensive care capacity, had been pushed beyond the brink, that they were grappling with some really awful decisions. They could not admit to intensive care every patient who they would normally have admitted to intensive care, and they were having to choose between their patients. And so there was a real feeling that this was also something that the UK was potentially going to face, that we were only a couple of weeks behind Italy, potentially 2 or 3 weeks behind, and that there was a short window in which to identify some guidance for clinicians faced with these potential decisions. I think it's worthwhile just stepping back and say, well, what's the reason for having the guidance? And I think there are kind of 4 clear ethical reasons why people might seek out guidance of this kind for triage. One is to ensure consistency. So the same types of decisions being made by doctors in different places. Secondly, expediency. So there was, it certainly looks as though clinicians were having to make very large numbers of decisions. So there was a need to be able to make those in an efficient way. It's all very well having a kind of very careful, rigorous approach to triage, but if you've literally going from one patient to another needing intubation, you don't have a lot of time to make these decisions. Third, of course, it was important that these decisions were made on the basis of the right factors. So they needed to have a strong ethical basis. And then fourth, and not insignificantly and relevantly to the argument that Katie was making back in the commentary that she wrote at the time, was that if clinicians were going to have to make these decisions, and in the absence of guidance, there was a real concern about where that would leave them in terms of their vulnerability and liability subsequently. I think it's also worthwhile, as a bit of background, noting something that I've talked about for a long time, which is the Scylla and Charybdis of guideline writing. So there are 2 different extremes of ways that guidance, triage guidance, could go wrong. So at one side, Scylla is the 5-6-headed monster on this side. You could write guidance that's very clear and prescriptive. For example, nobody with an age of more than 65 is going to be admitted to intensive care. But such lines are inevitably arbitrary, hard to get agreement on, extremely vulnerable to attack and bad headlines. They're vulnerable to ethical criticism. There's an ethicist called Robert Veitch in the States who talked about medical guidance that proposed criteria that had only technical but no fundamental ethical justification. But on the other hand, such guidance is extremely easy to apply. It's very quick and to work out if a patient meets these sorts of guidance. So that's Scylla on one side, but on the other at the other end of the spectrum is Charybdis guidelines that indicate, for example, that intensive care admission should not be provided for anybody with poor prognosis. But of course, that is incredibly vague, very hard to apply, and vulnerable to all sorts of inconsistency in how people interpret prognosis. But it's very easy to write a guideline like that. Everyone can agree that that's the point when you might not admit to a patient to intensive care, and it's easy to defend. So those are the two extremes, and as those who remember their Greek mythology, the dilemma of the ship of Odysseus' ship sailing between Scylla and Charybdis was that it was not possible to sail out of reach of Scylla and out of reach of the whirlpool Charybdis. So there is, although people aim for the middle path, there is no safe middle path. Okay, so that's the reason why the ethical guidance, triage guidance was sought. What guidance am I going to focus on in particular? Well, indeed, we might think guidance, what guidance, as opposed to which guidance, unlike a number of other countries that had pre-existing off-the-shelf pandemic guidance that had involved public consultation in previous years. The UK pandemic guidance had been shelved, and it looked from the outside as if there was very little preparation in terms of UK guidance. But very rapidly, in the second half of March, NICE started to produce, or produced something. It was, on the one hand, it was quite specific. It said doctors should assess something called clinical frailty, which was a numerical score for the degree of frailty, and suggested that a particular score was significant in some way, though then it was a little bit vague about what doctors should do if the patient was more than that particular score. So there was NICE guidance, but didn't refer to anything else other than clinical frailty that might be relevant to triage decisions. Also simultaneously in late March, behind the scenes, the Moral and Ethical Advisory Group, and there was some mention of that at the last of these webinars by Jonathan Montgomery about the role of this group, in conjunction with the Intensive Care Society, were working on something more specific. And indeed, they developed a draft of a decision support tool that would include clinical frailty, which NICE had already endorsed, in conjunction with a rating score based on age and a rating of comorbidities, all of which had been looked like they were associated with outcome from COVID-19, from the figure that was coming out of data that was coming out of China. And they suggested a particular score looking at the combination of these, at which it might be appropriate to consider ward-based care rather than intensive care. But as many who are at this webinar will be aware, that tool was never authorized. It was developed and then shelved. And as early as the beginning of April, the New York Times was reporting first that this plan had been put on the back burner, and the tool was officially sidelined. So what happened then? There was NICE guidance. There wasn't this decision support tool. This was the close-up of one of the Imperial College modelings. So you can see here, this was the black curve exceeding the red line of sort of absolute maximum ICU capacity. The yellow line with some mitigation measures. The green line was what would happen if everybody did what they were told and stayed home. This was, in fact, on the same scale, the actual peak in intensive care, critical care beds. So the peak actually looked like it matched pretty well with the best case scenario from the Imperial College modelling. There was a peak of 3,000 patients in intensive care beds in early middle of April, but well short of the absolute maximum critical care capacity. So that was all good news. But as some of you will have read, there has been a lot of discussion subsequently about what might have happened, particularly in the course of late March and early April. There was a long piece in the Times criticizing triage that might have happened in some places that were extremely experiencing extreme pressure. There was a suggestion that this triage tool, which had been officially shelved but had been shared by many clinicians in intensive care, might have been being used behind the scenes. And there was a discussion about whether pre-hospital triage was occurring so that patients were not being referred to hospital because it was anticipated that they wouldn't get into intensive care. So these issues, the benefits of triage guidance were here being seen partly because there wasn't clear guidance, or there was insufficient clear guidance. I'm not going to focus on the answer to these empirical questions. I'm going to focus on some ethical questions that I think might have been raised about the triage guidance that was mooted or that was actually available. I'm going to focus on three questions. So first is it justified to triage patients for potential life-saving therapy on the basis of frailty? Secondly, what do we know about what the public would support? There has been no studies like had occurred in the States that have tried to engage the public in pandemic triage planning in the UK. And thirdly, how do these triage tools work? How do they differ from non-pandemic triage, or what would occur in the absence of such tools? I'm going to provide just a little taste of the answers to each of these. So the first of these, this interesting question about whether it's ethical to withhold treatment from patients on the grounds that they are very frail, has actually been, the clinical question has been mooted by intensivists for some time. Frailty, perhaps better than any other individual factor, predicts mortality in older patients, but not just old patients admitted to intensive care. However, frailty is not futility. In this study from 2017, even patients with very high degrees of frailty, a proportion of them, perhaps as many as 50% of them, if they're admitted to intensive care, can survive. This is with non-COVID related illness. So in a paper that I've got forthcoming in the American Journal of Bioethics, I look at the criteria that are arguably relevant, or at least just relevant on some ethical theories to triage in the event of overwhelming demand, the probability of survival, the duration that somebody might survive for, their quality of life if they survive, and frailty is clearly associated with all of these, and data from the pandemic, the first wave of the pandemic, shows the same relationship between frailty and COVID mortality as seen prior to the pandemic. Of course, there are significant concerns that people might raise about age or disability-based discrimination. However, I think there are responses to those. I'm not going to articulate them here for reasons of time. And similarly, concerns about whether frailty-based triage would exacerbate existing sociodemographic inequality, I don't think rules out this factor. But I've proposed in this paper, and if people are interested, I can share that with you shortly, that there is a need to be explicit about the reasons why frailty is relevant, and that allows it to be applied consistently and not, as suggested by NICE, restricted to those of a particular age. I'm going to move on to this interesting question of what factors the public would support. We performed, and hopefully will shortly have published, it's available as a preprint, a relatively large, the first ever study with a sample of the UK public, more than 750 members, asking them a series of triage dilemmas to identify which factors they thought a doctor should take into consideration if they had to choose which patient would get a ventilator. And those who answered this survey, and they were representative of the UK population for ethnicity, income, age, gender, employment, thought that patients with a higher chance of survival, who would survive for longer, who would have a shorter period of treatment in intensive care, were younger and were less frail, ought to be chosen preferentially for treatment. Highly relevant, perhaps, to some of the things that others might say, those who we surveyed endorsed the idea of withdrawing or stopping intensive care in favor of another patient with a higher chance of survival. And although they were somewhat less inclined to support this than for withholding treatment for a patient where treatment has not been started, actually a very clear majority were supportive in principle of withdrawing, stopping intensive care for a patient in favor of another patient who had a better prognosis. And finally, I'm just going to give you perhaps again a little taste of something that, again, is not yet published, but it's whether these criteria actually track onto what we care most, which is the decisions that people might make if they didn't have to make them in this terrible hurry and in this terrible pressure for bed. So we audited in a single hospital where these decision tools were not being used and where indeed capacity was not exceeded, so there was no need to ration beds. And we looked at what decisions were actually made in the peak of the pandemic and their relationship to these hypothetical scores. And what you can see is that patients who had higher scores were less likely to be referred to intensive care. Again, this wasn't because the intensive care was being rationed, but it was because the clinicians who were looking after them felt that it was not appropriate in the circumstances. Those who had lower scores had higher survival. Again, it's not surprising because age, clinical frailty, and comorbidities have all been independently shown to be related to survival. And this score was better at predicting survival and better at predicting a decision about intensive care than frailty or age alone. So it suggests that this tool maps onto the decisions that clinicians would make in the absence of a need for rationing, which reinforces the idea that this is potentially tracking what clinicians at least think is relevant. It doesn't prove that they're making the right decisions, of course. I'm going to wind up here because I only have a very short period of time. I've pointed out this challenge of guidance, the Scylla and Charybdis. I've suggested that the problems, the controversies are partly because there wasn't adequate clear guidance for triage in the first wave of the pandemic. But if this guidance had been used and had been endorsed, they are actually suggesting factors that are ethically relevant, that are endorsed by the public, and appear to be empirically sound. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dominic. That was illuminating and insightful. Thanks so much. So before moving on to our next talk, where we'll have Katie Gallop speaking to us, we now just have a couple of minutes if any of our panelists have any questions or comments. So if you do, could you just raise your hand? Right, Mark, please go ahead.
Thanks, Dom. That was really good. And I do later on. I want to come back to the Scylla and Charybdis, that old philosopher's favourite. But what I wanted to get you to just say a little bit more about your 4 rationales for guidance. Could you? So what I'm puzzled about is how each of those 4, and particularly the first 3, how they actually answer the question why, or why we need guidance. Yeah, so I'm just not seeing the connection between them.
So the 4 that I suggested were consistency. So if you haven't got guidance, then the possibility is that people will, in different places, be making decisions on a different basis. You end up with a postcode lottery. Indeed, that's part of the claim of the Sunday Times, that in some places people were triaging and limiting treatment, other places they weren't. So that seems to be clearly an advantage of having some guidance. Secondly, let me see if I can go back so I can remember exactly what
expediency.
So the expediency argument is about time. So if you have to make a decision in a very short space of time, you need a heuristic, and that's partly what these are designed to do. They're designed to accelerate decision making. Mm-hmm. Thirdly, what you want is that decisions to be made on the basis of the right sorts of factors. So guidance, at least potentially, if it's not the right guidance, of course it won't be on the right sort of factors. But if guidance is thought through, then potentially it's going to be on the right sort of factors, not the wrong ones. Not, for example, based on implicit bias about disability or race or whatever it is. And fourthly, I think it's obvious that if there's national guidance and it tells clinicians that it's okay to triage on the basis of these criteria, that they have a very strong legal defense. And if there isn't guidance, I think they're on thinner ice.
Yeah. So I mean, just to sort of be transparent about this, I guess my question, with consistency, I wonder whether what's doing the work there is a fairness claim. So we want to treat people equally, is what the point is there. But the other thing, and I guess what's really in the background here is I understand why we might care of those, but what I guess my general thought is, and that's a general question, is why that leads to guidance. Because it seems like we might be able to do expediency in other ways than guidance, and we might be able to do fairness in other ways than guidance, or guidance of particular sort. So, I accept that those are, but I guess the question that I think is still open is why those accounts give us guidance as the answer, whereas they might give us other sorts of things that can manage it, and in particular, different sorts of guidance.
So I mean, partly I think it's about the particular circumstances of a pandemic, and so the circumstances of a pandemic for clinicians is like the circumstances of a battlefield. It's having to make, in a very short space of time, many high stakes decisions. And the sorts of approaches to ethical decisions that are applied in normal circumstances, to kind of think very carefully, to engage with all the parties, to consider carefully, to reflect hard, just simply is not an available option when you have 30, 50, what was mooted 100 patients being potentially presenting in a day with critically ill. So that's, I think, why you need something more substantive.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thanks for that. Do any other of our panelists have any questions? Dominic? No, not at this point. Right, well, thank you so much then, Dominic. And let's move on. So, Katie, thanks again for coming. I've introduced you already, so I won't do so again. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to test. Can you hear me? Great. Well, I'm going to look at why we didn't get a single piece of national guidance. And I think the question that Mark's just asked about why we need guidance at all is really interesting. And it would be perhaps interesting to come back and think, well, could we have done this differently and in a better way? I don't know why we didn't end up with national guidance. I suspect there's some inside track I'm not on. So I don't have the answer, but I thought it was worth asking the question. I haven't got any slides, so you're just going to have my face and me droning on. So anybody who wants to nip out and put the kettle on, let alone visit the facilities, now is the time. And you'll be able to pick it up, a bit like the Archers, when you come back. But back in April, the government commissioned modelling, which indicated that 2 million people in the UK could require hospital treatment. And we already knew, as Dominic has illustrated, that hospitals in Italy had been overwhelmed and doctors there had had to make impossible decisions about who should and shouldn't get a ventilator. But the tragedy for those patients and the moral distress of those treating them could only be guessed at. The ethical dilemma was very stark, and it was, can a ventilator ever lawfully be removed from a ventilated patient who may be deriving benefit from it for the purpose of providing that ventilator to a different patient? It seemed obvious to me that a national conversation between doctors, ethicists, politicians, COVID bereaved, COVID recovered patients, families of those in hospital and care homes, members of the public generally was imperative. If the worst was going to come to the UK, then nobody ought to find themselves in the eye of that storm uninformed or in a panicky and reactive state. So concerned colleagues and I looked to see what was happening, and I was pretty confident that a triage czar or similar would have been appointed to coordinate that national conversation. But there was no such person. And instead of a national conversation, what was happening was that lots of separate ethical organisations were having identical internal conversations with themselves, duplicating effort and pushing out guidance documents, none of which answered the ethical dilemma which was unfolding in Italy. So at the end of March, beginning of April, the GMC, NICE, the Royal College of Physicians, the Royal College of Surgeons, the BMA, and the Chief Medical Officer of Scotland all published separate guidance documents. NICE came out first on the 20th of March, and as Dominic has explained, it used a clinical frailty scale to assist in the decision-making process. There was an immediate legal challenge on the grounds that the use of that scale for resource allocation purposes didn't fully respect the rights of the disabled, particularly healthy adults with autism or learning difficulties, and those with stable conditions such as cerebral palsy. And 10 days after publishing, NICE had to publish revised guidance, which, coming from NICE, I think we have to understand, why did they get themselves into that pickle? I don't know, but it's not a good start, is it? Now, all of these documents were thoughtful, they were all well-intentioned, and all of them were problematic to some extent. And the problems were, one, even when the issue of too many patients and not enough resources was raised, brackets in most of the guidance, it wasn't, none of the guidance provided a clinical decision-making framework, and none of it set out the relevant criteria for that framework. None of it told the individual doctor in A&E on a Sunday night with 3 patients needing a ventilator and only 1 ventilator, how they should think and what they should do. Doctors are familiar with, and patients and their families grasp, the concept of best interest decision making. But best interest doesn't apply when the treatment dilemma is a shortage of life-saving equipment. Those waters were uncharted, and they stayed uncharted. 2, the withdrawal question. When can you take a patient off a ventilator to give that ventilator to another patient was barely mentioned. And 3, all of the guidelines put the onus on local, hospital by hospital, doctor by doctor decision making. There was no national framework. So for patients, the lack of a national policy covering the whole of the NHS meant the prospect of inconsistent, unfair, divisive decision making, as Mark and Dominic have just discussed. And for doctors, the guidance did little to lift the moral burden from their shoulders. It didn't tell them what framework to apply, and it left them arguably at some legal risk. The guidelines provided ethical guidance, totally understandable. They weren't legal advice. How could they be? So there was a real possibility that trusts and doctors acting in accordance with the guidelines might find themselves acting unlawfully. Now, one might have thought that after we got through the first wave, the period of intense fear and uncertainty, with some ICUs teetering on capacity and reported near shortages of oxygen, the time would come for a national conversation. One would be wrong. On the 25th of October, the Sunday Times published a story alleging that frail and elderly patients were denied care by clinicians in wave 1, in part because clinicians drafted a triage tool for use if the NHS was overwhelmed. In response to that report, I had a look this afternoon on NHS England's website, and it's quite an interesting read. It has a detailed point-by-point rebuttal. The tone is quite angry, my perception. Other people may differ. It has quotes from the Dean of the Intensive Care Faculty of Medicine, I think, the President of the Royal College of Emergency Medicine, and Professor Montgomery, who I believe is watching. And all of them say essentially the same thing. Yes, we started drafting a triage tool, but we didn't finish it because we didn't need it. And there was no lack of resources. Repeat, there was no lack of resources. If you didn't hear us the first time, can we just say there wasn't a lack of resources? Thank you. And the website finishes up by quoting a spokesperson for the Faculty of Intensive Care Medicine saying that, quote, implementation of guidance is the responsibility of individual trusts, unquote. So the opportunity to develop a framework for resource allocation decision-making in the optimal circumstances, one might think, of a very recent near-miss, direct experience, intense reflection and thoughtfulness, with the public mind engaged, willing and wanting to grapple with these most difficult of issues, asking the questions, do we prioritise? Who do we prioritise? Is withholding better than withdrawing, or are they equal? Can it ever be right to take a life to save a life? The unprecedented opportunity that actually COVID has given to us, looking for silver linings, it's not only been taken, but that opportunity appears to have been determined to be unnecessary. It's difficult to read the website without developing the feeling that perhaps there is some resistance somewhere in the NHS to having national guidance that is clear, publicly available, and implemented in every NHS hospital. It's difficult to reject entirely that perhaps the system might be happier with uninformed than informed patients, or the system doesn't trust that patients are capable of being co-workers in developing answers to difficult questions. Now, perhaps part of any resistance to having a national framework is likely to be political. Governments don't want to have a public conversation about what if the state doesn't have the resources to save lives. And the pragmatic answer, well, we didn't run out, so we don't need to talk about what we would have done if we had have run out, because can we just say we didn't run out, is politically convenient, but I would suggest it isn't grown up and it isn't fair. The mature public response to lockdown has demonstrated that people can be trusted to engage with that difficult question. And if that response experientially wasn't enough, Dominic's research has rather proved it. So there's politics. Is there something more? I want to look at something completely different in Monty Python way. In July, Baroness Cumberledge published a report called First Do No Harm, and it was a review of 3 medical products which she found had caused avoidable harm to thousands of people. And those were sodium valproate and Primidos, which are products used by pregnant women, which caused harm to their unborn children, and pelvic mesh, which is treated to treatment for organ prolapse and particularly urinary incontinence, women particularly affected and children. And she said, I'm going to quote some quite big chunks here. Quote, in our research, we have been astonished how the healthcare system, which includes the NHS, private providers, the regulators and professional bodies, manufacturers and policymakers, is disjointed, siloed, unresponsive and defensive. It does not adequately recognise that patients are its sole purpose. It has failed to listen to their concerns. And what she's decided is that the patient voice needs to be strengthened. One of her recommendations is for a patient safety commissioner, and that person will be the patient's port of call, their listener, their advocate, who holds the system to account, monitors trends and demands action. And this advocate will be the golden thread tying the disjointed system together in the interests of those who matter most. Now, the focus of her review was medical products, innovation, technology, but it made me wonder, what would a patient safety commissioner have said about an NHS that in the course of a pandemic, when there was a risk of insufficient life-saving resources, left decision-making about who got those resources, who lived and who didn't, to individual doctors, with the result that the patient in the ambulance might live if they said, please take me to hospital A, and died if they said, I don't mind, let's go to hospital B. What would that commissioner's response be to a suite of guidance documents and providers who didn't, and whether that's because they couldn't or they wouldn't, we don't know, produce one national framework for resource allocation so that patients knew that wherever they went, they would be treated fairly, equally, and the same? We don't know, but there is a clue as to what the Baroness might have had to say in what she had to say about informed consent and patient information. And she said this: in response to Montgomery, we've seen a rapid growth in the production of patient information leaflets that differ hugely in the amount of information on risks and benefits. The sheer variety of patient information leaflets available and the consent forms that flow from these are bewildering and a major source of confusion. Patient decision aids are important. If they are to be credible, they must reflect the most up-to-date and valid clinical consensus of the risks and benefits associated with the intervention in question, including what is not known. They should be validated and standardized for each procedure. Most importantly, they must have been jointly developed with patients so that they accurately and fully reflect the patient experience and outcomes. We see no reason for there ever to be more than one collaboratively produced and agreed patient decision-making aid for each surgical procedure or medical intervention. We recognise that tailored versions may be required for different populations, for example, if a procedure is carried out in an adolescent and adult population, but the core information related to risks, options, and alternatives should remain the same. Baroness Cumberledge was looking at medical products and innovation from the patient's perspective. If you look at COVID and the risk of insufficient resources from that same perspective, the urgent need for a doctor and patient decision aid, which is developed collaboratively and which is standard across the NHS, seems to me to be obvious. If that's right, and if it's obvious from the patient perspective, why is it not obvious from the doctor perspective, or perhaps more fairly, from the perspective of the organisations and the policymakers that exist to support doctors and patients? We don't know why, And my feeling, I realise this perhaps been a bit personal and polemical, is that we need to know why. We won't make progress until we understand what the psychological barriers may be. Over and out.
Wow, thank you. That was as precise and compelling as ever. Okay, so I think we already have some questions from Dominic. Go ahead, Dom.
Katie, there were a few things that I was going to pick you up on, but I'm going to pick you up on something you were talking about at the end, which is about informed consent. And I took your argument to be about a different type of patient health professional discussion, which is the kind of community level discussion. Because the precise nature of resource allocation decisions is that they don't come under a standard informed consent model. Because if a treatment is being denied because the resource is not available, actually informed consent doesn't apply. But I think that's so one area where that's particularly relevant is in terms of Dnr decisions. So the standard approach to Dnr decisions includes an informed consent model. So the notion is that the patient or surrogate is at least involved in the decision. So admittedly, clinicians can make a clinical decision that resuscitation is not appropriate. But in a context where potentially intensive care is deemed to be not appropriate, the question is whether actually the standard way of framing resuscitation needs to change. And in fact, that I interpreted some of the confusion and controversy about Dnr orders in the context of the first wave of the pandemic as emblematic of this particular problem in failing to understand a shift in the locus of decision making from the individual patient doctor to the problem of limited resources.
Right. Okay. Well, thinking about informed consent, I think one of the things that's been really interesting about the pandemic is that it's it's almost as though the population as a whole has been the individual patient in a funny sort of way. We've all been subject to decision making being taken out of our hands by having a lockdown with this interference with our normal human right to go about our business. But it's almost as though we have been sort of collectively a patient. And I suppose what I was thinking was, I was really irked and upset actually that there was a window of opportunity to have a national conversation and to say to the public, let us together do an informed consent process. Imagine you are in that situation. How do you want decisions to be made? What is the right way? What's the right ethical way forward? Let's all decide that together, which is kind of what you've done with your research. And that wasn't done. Instead of which we have this massive amount of effort. I mean, the amount of effort that it takes to provide one set of guidance and all of these different organisations, every different Royal College, intensive care faculty, one CMO in Scotland, other CMOs elsewhere, NICE getting it wrong the first time round, and so on. How much better would it have been? And I'm not sure to what extent patients were actually involved or members of the public were involved at all, if there'd been a collaborative effort to get together and do that as a nation. So yes, there's no informed decision making when you're actually in intensive care and there's a shortage of resources, but we could have done, I suppose, some advanced decision making is kind of what I was getting at. DNRs, I think the confusion, the misapprehension that there was is all part and parcel of the same thing. We didn't have the conversation. We didn't develop definitions we could all use, language we could all use. And so there was something of a dialogue of the deaf. I don't know if that really answers the points you were getting at. I suspect it doesn't, but it might sort of look at some of them around the edges.
I mean, so the point that you made at the end, which is about shifting, drawing the analogy with shifting to advanced decision making. So the idea that we might collectively make decisions in advance is very similar to a thought that I've had about the fundamental problem seemed to me was that the UK had failed to think and to prepare for this problem. So the striking example, which I mentioned briefly, is Pittsburgh. So in the US, um, researchers in Pittsburgh had engaged in the last decade a whole series of public engagement, public fora, gauging public views. They then incorporated them into guidance. They had a long process of consultation over a long period of time when there was no pandemic happening. So, and the huge advantage of that is politicians could endorse it because it was incredibly collaborative, but it was also subacute, and it was all hypothetical. So they could say, yes, we accept that this would be right, but of course we don't have to make it now. And it was not politically controversial because it didn't apply. But in the heat of the moment, it was completely impossible politically, I think, to have that conversation. So we missed that opportunity. And as you say, we might have been able to do it in between waves, but again, we seem to have missed that opportunity to advance plan.
I will send the link to the blog that we wrote in Chambers, but one of the places that we looked at when we were writing that was New York. And like Pittsburgh, New York did a big public engagement over a long period of time exercise to come up with triaging and resource allocation guidelines. And they did lots of focus groups with members of the public, and it was refined and it was discussed and it was adopted. Huge piece of work. And then, quite astonishingly, when it came to putting it into practice, as you say, and New York came quite close to having resource and ventilator shortage, the document was disavowed by the state of New York, and they were told it wasn't a legal framework for decision making. It didn't have any legal force at all, and it was merely a guideline. So even when you've done the work, had the national conversation, the statewide conversation, and have made your advanced decision making, politically, it's such a hot potato that politicians just won't even talk about the possibility that there might be a shortage, because if you talk about it, then people might think that it's going to happen, and that would be politically impossible. So the public is capable of being mature and sensible about this, and your research, I think, is really interesting in that regard. It's politicians who aren't capable of talking to the public properly.
Go ahead, Mark.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Katie. That was really interesting. So, I completely agree with you about patients shouldn't go into these sorts of potential triage and withdrawal situations uninformed. And one of the things that we did when I was involved in Buckinghamshire, we did, and I think in other places, made sure that the conversation that happened when the patient was admitted into the hospital, this is around sort of late March, early April, that the conversation included discussion about that possibility of withdrawal and the ways in which that decision would be made if it had to be made. And so the patients were informed in that sense, and I think there was a lot of work could have been done about that. But I mostly wanted to ask you, we've been talking about resource allocation, and the NHS is really quite used to resource allocation and has quite sophisticated, in a lot of places, has quite sophisticated mechanisms for making those decisions. Indeed, there are individual funding request panels, and some of the NICE committees, for example, actively deny patients treatment as a result of these processes. It was sort of puzzling to me that wasn't the sort of obvious route to take, to say what we need is the right kind of process, and that's localized. Oxfordshire has its own, Thames Valley has its own. NICE makes specific decisions about its, cancer drug, etc. That seems to be, and I think I agree with you. The politicians have steered clear of national guidance in healthcare resource allocation generally, but nevertheless, and I think the law backs this up, it's down to local decision makers because they're the budget holders. But how do you think that fits into this context? Why can't we just apply that across?
I think partly because those sorts of resource allocation decisions are purely to do with money. I think a lot of them are about provision of extensive drugs, or what they call quality of, come on Dominic, quality of life, adjusted years, thank you. And I mean, look, let's face it, politicians hate talking about these, even being made to talk about the idea that the NHS doesn't supply every need for as long as is necessary all the time ever. And I think the public puts its head in the sand about that, and we sort of pretend that you know, everybody gets what they need all the time. And then there's a national outrage with sort of a national hurrah when you have something like the Orkambi decision. Do you remember that? The drug for children with cystic fibrosis that would suddenly massively extend their lives. And we sort of have this, isn't it wonderful we've done this, with the same as, I can't believe we haven't always done this. How can that ever have been right? And I think the difficulty, that the difference there is that's money to fund ongoing need of a large number of people. And this is about something as stark as a ventilator, which of itself isn't necessarily that expensive. And the acuteness of, these are people in intensive care dying right now in the hospital down the road. It just brings into the sharpest possible focus on an individual level, something that in other circumstances we turn a blind eye to because it's generalized and complicated.
I mean, is it fair to say that the problem that you're getting at is the problem of why don't we have enough ventilators, not who gets the ones that we have? Is that, I mean,
well, there was that. I mean, why, you know, why was it so difficult to get PPE? Why was it difficult to get the right sort? You know, suddenly we could fund a whole lot of Nightingale's hospitals, but we couldn't staff them. But, you know, and then we didn't run out of ventilators. And why didn't we have enough oxygen? We used to talk around people about sort of putting a glowing splint into a test tube, and it really didn't seem that difficult to actually make the stuff, but apparently it is, you know, all that kind of stuff. I think it was, my real question is, why did we not end up with one national guideline? There was something in the system that made it impossible for doctors to put everything else aside and just agree one guideline. And that is what I do not understand, because it's clearly in patients' interest. Why should you have to go fossicking about on lots of different NHS trusts' website to find out what's your resource allocation prioritization framework for if you run out of ventilators? Where should I take my granny, child, whoever it is, if they get COVID and can't breathe tomorrow? And it's not as if trusts make this easy to find or even publish it at all. Buckingham might have been better than other places, but I don't think it's easy.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for the questions and for a brilliant talk. Let's move on now to Richard.
Thank you. I'll just share my screens and check that you can all hear me. Could I get a thumbs up? Yep, fantastic, lovely. Well, thanks to Emma and today for the invitation. I'm going to talk to the title Principles for Pandemics, plural, for reasons I'll explain in a few slides' time. First of all, I should say right at the outset that, there we go. Thanks to my collaborators on a project kindly funded by the Elizabeth Blackwell Institutes at the University of Bristol, but I should emphasize this is very much my take on the following issues, but I'll draw to some extent on some of our research. So these aren't necessarily the views of that wider group, or indeed the various groups I work with, including as Vice Chair of the UK Clinical Ethics Network, and as a member of such committees as the Ethics Committee of the BMA and of the Royal College of GPs. So if we go back in time, and I'm taking a step back from this specific question of triage and allocation, just thinking broadly across the piece about the professional ethical guidance that's been issued in England and Wales in particular. And you recall, going back to late March, numerous commentators, myself and Dave included, were asking essentially, where is the guidance? The sort of question Katie just brought into sharp focus just then. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see some of the answers. So there is some of the guidance that had this distinctive professional ethical guidance outlook. And what we aim to do in our short project was, within a particular time frame, essentially ask what are the principles adopted by professional ethical guidance in England and Wales for dealing with this COVID pandemic specifically. And that required us to use a couple of working definitions, which I'll offer up, but might be points for discussion later. First of all, a suggestion of professional ethical guidance. So we saw that as published by a professional organization aimed at guiding health and social care professionals, and ethical insofar as it refers to ethical attitudes, behaviors, motivations, or values. One of the open questions there is, what's the distinction between what you might call clinical guidance and what you might call ethical guidance? But leaving that aside, what we were looking for was the principles. Following other authors, we defined these as general norms that seek to guide action, but also, of course, leave room for discretion or the individual professional's judgment. And we ran the searches online and we analyzed these using thematic content analysis. And in one sense, the news was good. So we found 28 documents within our time period capturing, very much converging on what we described as 13 overlapping, or our word of the day, imbricated principles. So these were to an extent separate, but like roof tiles, they also somewhat overlapped. And the other thing to note, and this talks to some of the discussion we've just been having, is this was principles for pandemics, because those 13 principles essentially mapped very closely onto a pre-existing pandemic flu framework, last updated in 2013. So initially the news is looking good. All these 28 documents seem to converge in one way or another on these 13 overlapping principles. However, questions undoubtedly arise, and I'm going to bombard you with questions, as my colleague Mark would expect. I might indicate some answers, but we can explore that further in questions. But the first question, really a big one for me, is really straightforward. What even is professional ethical guidance? What do we mean by this? And I don't think enough work has been done in this area. I dipped a toe in these waters early on in the pandemic with an admittedly quite a quick paper outlining some of the considerations, and these are somewhat merged. They're considerations of trying to identify what counts in the first instance as professional ethical guidance, and then there's dipping a toe in the waters of quality. So there might be questions around the source of it, its applicability, and the method and methodology by which the guidance was arrived at. But of course, that might be a slightly arcane question. What do we even mean by professional ethical guidance? But it's still an important one, I think. But beyond that, of course, and this has started to be aired in the conversation with Katie and with Dom, there will be questions about the substance of the guidance as well. So is the guidance that emanates, whoever has issued it, is it in some sense defensible? And put really crudely, you might judge that externally or internally. So by judging it externally, by some external perspective, for example, we've seen, including from Casey and other legal commentators, various complaints that the guidance that was issued took a particular perspective that didn't pay enough heed to existing legal values or principles. So the law wasn't duly accounted for, was one of the allegations. An alternative ethical external perspective rather would be indeed ethical. So commentators coming from other ethical commitments arguing that what's on the face of the guidance gets the values wrong in some way. And here we have at the bottom of the slide, John Harris as one example. And both of these commentators were referring specifically to the ethics guidance from the BMA, but there have been complaints about some of the other guidance as well. But in terms of internal defensibility, that is asking essentially, is the guidance observing the very principles that it seeks to advance? And I'll come back to that in a couple of slides' time. I'll keep racing you through the variety of questions that occur to me at least. And the next one is, who prepares the guidance? And that might mean certainly who are the individuals on the relevant groups? That's certainly a live question. But also, what are the settings or regions or levels, in a sense, from which the guidance is emanating? A couple of observations here that take us below the national level, but I will come back to the national level in a minute. And I'm aware that next time, the next webinar, you'll talk more about clinical ethics committees and the like. But in terms of where we are, we were struck in the UK Clinical Ethics Network that certainly the number of groups at various levels grew. Now, these aren't formal data. These are essentially, on the left-hand side, groups known to the UK Clinical Ethics Network. We understand there may well be more. In fact, there are more, and potentially even many more than we are aware of. So that's one research or audit challenge. How many of these groups are out there? But the other thing that struck me was the types of groups, particularly in terms of levels, if you like, was becoming quite different in this picture. So to take an example from my own work, I've long served on the Bristol Clinical Ethics Advisory Committee that serves both trusts here in Bristol. But since the pandemic, I've joined newly formed groups at the Devon County level and more broadly at the Southwest level. And that also raises numerous questions around, apart from anything else, the relationships between such groups. There might be questions of authority, but certainly questions of responsibility, accountability. What are the particular relationships between them, even with the proviso that these groups tend to be below the national level, advisory at most? But leaving that aside, if that's one question, who prepares the guidance, of course, another really important one is who informs the guidance? And I think that's starting to come out very clearly from what Katie was saying a moment ago. So there have been concerns about those most directly affected not necessarily being party to the development of guidance or providing evidence to the development of such guidance. So there are concerns around engagement and around involvement. So if you go back to the principles, and this is where we can think internally, are these pieces of guidance actually observing their own principles? You might well ask that of some of them, because it's certainly not clear in some of the cases how much involvement people had. So patients, citizens, service users, and so on and so forth. So if you think about the principles I referred to on the slide summarizing the 13 we found, they included respect, inclusiveness, communication, transparency. How far were those principles actually observed by the committees that developed the guidance themselves? And there are related questions of involvement, and these have even hit a court over the summer months during the pandemic. Courts haven't often dealt with clinical ethics committees, at least so far as I've seen, but notably, one judge referred to the question of involvement by patients and family members in clinical ethics work specifically. So this is increasingly going to be a big question. But one thing I would note, and this might be a good opportunity not only to publicize the work we've done on the Devon Ethical Reference Group, but also just to show that it is possible to do this sort of engagement involvement even during a pandemic. So the Devon Ethical Framework did a great deal of public engagement work to ensure that we got people's views through a variety of smaller and larger online events. And they directly contributed to the guidance we issued specifically on allocation and withdrawal of treatment during the pandemic. And I can provide the link to the website for anyone who's interested. But I suppose the big question to leave you with is, does the guidance actually guide? Whether we look at an individual piece of guidance or across the piece, but given that they broadly converge on those 13 principles, I think these sorts of questions might be asked of a great deal. And in terms of perceived gaps, this possibility that the guidance framework, or landscape rather, is incomplete, we're struck by, Casey referred briefly to it earlier, we know that Wales and Scotland have ethical frameworks for healthcare professionals. We know in England we have the Department of Health and Social Care level statement of ethical framework for social care. We didn't find one for healthcare in England. So that feels like an immediate gap, unless, and this is an open question, the pandemic flu principles are supposed to be doing all the work for us. Even leaving that aside, we have allegations of a lack of clarity. And I've seen in some of the pieces written, including by Dave, that of course these principles, and we certainly found this, are pretty high level in their articulations. There's certainly going to need specification, and there's always going to be that room for judgment. So is the guidance sufficiently clear? I think Katie's answer earlier is probably not. And then there are questions of consistency. So amongst the challenges there you do have different principles, but there's no clear method offered for balancing out the principles when they're in tension, or indeed if they're in outright contradiction. So to give a quick illustration, if we go back to Dom's main area of concern in his presentation earlier, he was talking about considerations of justice, considerations most distinctive of public health ethics, essentially. Other principles within one and the same document will refer to more individualistic principles like respect that are more characteristic of clinical ethics. So even at that quite meta level, there's going to sometimes be a tension, or the principles are going to point in different directions. Well, how do I, the professional, resolve it? Great, I've got the guidance. I probably need a bit more than the guidance and the principles alone. Also concerned that sometimes the different documents articulate what is labeled as and broadly described as the same principle, but there might well be differences in the way they're articulated. And indeed, there might be differences in how they're specified. For example, how this idea of justice as a principle really cashes out in practice. So, as I say, Mark would expect, lots of questions for you, no clear answers, hopefully an indication of a few answers from something I've said, but I will leave you with a plea. Let's not just follow the science as if there's one single science, or even, well, leaving that aside, let's not just follow the science, I'll just leave it as brutally stated as that. Let's make sure we follow the ethics. And what we feel we need going forward is a much clearer sense of a joined up ethical roadmap. Thanks for listening. I'll stop sharing there.
Thank you, Richard. That was superb, and you have raised some very interesting questions. But rather than turn to the speakers now, because it's 6:10, what I hope we can do now is move on to your presentation, Mark, and then perhaps after that we might have a little bit of time for the speakers to ask questions, and then swiftly move on to the Q&A. I hope that's all right, Richard.
Okay, cool. Let me just get this. It worked before, so it should be okay now. There we go. So thanks, Dave and Emma, for this opportunity, and thanks to the panelists. It's been fantastically interesting so far, and I feel like there's a lot more to say about it. I thought I'd start a little bit. So I had a sort of slightly different involvement in the pandemic from some of the other people on the panel. So I sort of came into it a little bit late when Buckinghamshire, who was starting to think about organising an ethics committee, and then when the pandemic hit, then realised they needed to get a move on. And so I sort of came in and started somebody who was sort of helping them set that up. And so a lot of the guidance was already in the making or in circulation already. So we were in the position of saying, well, okay, so how do we decide which one we're going to use, and how do we sort of put this together into a process? Now, over the last sort of 6 months, there's been various different problems have come up. One of them was obviously the intensive care situation, but there was also, I think, as Katie mentioned, there's a really quite acute problem about oxygen, about having enough and how to do that, which is sort of really interesting. That it's a problem is interesting, but also it's slightly different from the intensive care case. And then finally, when we sort of got over the hill a little bit, I was involved in thinking about how we return to some semblance of normality. So the waiting lists in particular in Buckinghamshire, but across the country, went up, and there was a question about, now we have people competing for what is not a fully back engaged workforce. So not up to speed workforce, and how do we prioritize surgeries and treatments in that context? So that's another case where there was a little bit of guidance floating around about that and how we manage that. But so I picked up on asked Dominic a little bit about his 4 answers to why we have governance guidance, and I sort of wanted to sort of really focus in on that in the next couple of minutes. And the thing that was really striking to me about this, and I think something that hasn't really come up in the debate too much, is this question of whether or not guidance is designed to make things easier. And I think that this is a real trap. I think quite often the way we think about guidance is it's going to help us answer these questions, and that sort of worries me. It worries me because one of the things that seems important here when we're doing this is that we preserve the ethical difficulty, right? So when a clinician is faced with a really difficult problem, difficult ethical decision, it seems the guidance or the theory or whatever it is shouldn't remove that, right? So we shouldn't have a calculator, or we shouldn't have a committee, or we shouldn't have a set of rules that we follow that all of a sudden take away the nature of that problem. And I think it is a problem with the guidance because it tends to, a lot of the guidance tended to presume that that's what it's doing, that it's making it easier in certain kinds of ways. But now it is important that what I mean by making it easier here is this felt difficulty. And this is the thing, the felt difficulty of having to say to somebody that we can't fit you in intensive care. The difficulty of having to decide between the 3 patients when there's only 1 intensive care bed. I mean, it seems to me that's a real problem, a real risk that's faced in trusts like in Italy where they experience it. It's also something that's a bit more familiar in that context. It's important that what I mean by easier here is not about reducing complexity. So clinicians often make decisions that are very complex, and I don't think that we as ethicists, as people making guidance, should try to capture the complexity. I mean, there are people who are experts at this who know and have experience with that. I mean, I think what I'm focusing on here is this idea that this sort of felt ethical difficulty here. I mean, and you can see there are lots of examples where to save a life or not to save a life, the decision is not complex, and even the moral account, the ethical account of what's problematic, is not difficult. What's difficult is the nature of the decision. And so this is a sort of negative point about what guidance is not for, it seems to me. And it seems to me also something that's not really talked about very often, about how these things function. I think a couple of things follow from this, and this is where we get to Dom's 4 things a little bit. But again, I think there's a bit more nuanced. It's nuanced here about in this situation. So the first one, it seems to me, as a problematic answer for what the guidance is for, is that it's about making sure we get the right answer, making sure that we do the right thing. It seems to me this is not something that, unless we're falling into this mistake of trying to make decisions easier, then we're going to be trying to aim at the right answer or preventing the wrong answer. It's something about the nature of the difficulty and the nature of understanding the difficulty that seems to me to make that aim for guidance, namely preventing the wrong answer or getting the right answer, make that very difficult. One of the things I think, and this goes to a point that we were talking about with, that I was talking with Katie about, is this idea of promoting consistency of outcome rather than consistency of process. And again, this seems like a mistake. Again, this idea that what we're doing is making decisions easier by providing guidance is if we think that somehow the outcome that we're trying to promote can be solved in the guidance. I think all of the questions that Richard asked in the end there point to the fact that the guidance is really not going to do the work, and it can't be expected to do the work because of the fundamental nature of the decision at its source. So if what we're trying to do with our guidance is promote consistency of outcome so that everybody gets the same answer, then we're going to be trampling over this idea that these are really difficult decisions. And so one of the things that we've argued for is this idea, and this is what I was alluding to in the reference to resource allocation, is this idea that we can ask for consistency of process, because what people want, and this aligned with Dominic's idea about consistency or fairness, if people know that they are being treated fairly, then that's the best we can do in these difficult situations. And that's about a process. That's going to be about knowing that the right things are considered. The final point here is about whether or not we're ranking or determining the values. And we saw that exchange from Richard's slides, the claim about that the BMA guidance was utilitarian and John Harris having a problem with that. That might be one way of determining values, but we also might go the other way of ranking the values. And we might think that, as in the example of the original NICE guidance, which took frailty as a determiner, that's going to be about ranking and determining values. Now that's a very different set of processes, a different project from what I would think follows from this idea about them being difficult. Is that what we can do in the guidance is we can outline the values and say what the range of values are. And I think when we look across the content of the range of different guidance sets that were offered, that they're actually pretty consistent, so long as you remove the ranking and the determining, so long as you remove the attempt to get to the right answer and the idea that we're trying to get the same outcome in each case. It seems to me that there's actually the guidance said the same thing. So just in terms of where this gets us, where I take us that this gets us, what I think the answer to this question is what the guidance is for, is it's really about supporting those who have to make the hard decisions, those people on the front line who have to decide who gets what. And that seemed like the biggest threat that needed to be answered. And I want to include in that thing ensuring that people who are making those decisions understand that it's difficult. So we can't just, so this is guarding against the idea of, well, I do this every day, so I know. I mean, this is the idea that these sorts are pressing kinds of decisions. We need to make sure that we need to do something to help that set of decisions. And I think the other part of having the guidance, and this links to questions about assurances and the protection that Dominic talked about, is I think it's important that the guidance can allow people to understand that there is a way of making this decision, even if the answer and the outcome is going to vary, even if it means that some people don't get to ICU, or some people don't get the drug that they treat, or they get further down the list in terms of prioritization. They need to be able to understand how those decisions get made, both the frontline staff and the patients and carers, and for everybody else, so that we have a process. The last thing that I want to say is just this point, and to sort of answer Katie's question, which is, why didn't we come up with a single guideline? On this view, a single guideline, if it was the right kind of guideline, would be fine. It would be helpful, but it wasn't really necessary. What we need to make sure is that the decision-making processes, that the processes are consistent and use roughly the same set of considerations. And it would have been helpful to have that, but it wasn't necessary. And I think it wasn't necessary partly because it doesn't happen anywhere else in the NHS, particularly with respect to healthcare resource allocation. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a really interesting perspective on what guidance can't do and what guidance shouldn't try to do. Now, we only have about 10 minutes left, so I wonder if our speakers would mind if I hand it over to Dave now to see if there are any particularly pressing questions from the audience. If we do have a bit of time at the end, I'll come straight back to you. Is that okay? Marvellous. Okay. Thanks, Dave.
Okay, there were only a few questions, and I thought that I would start with the ones that perhaps are most provocative that have come in from Jonathan Montgomery. It poses something of a nice dilemma for our panelists in terms of the importance of guidelines. One question which I think was directed to you, Richard, was if you hope to secure ethical consensus, that would put you, and I presume Mark and me, out of a job. On the other hand, there's a second question from Jonathan, which I think is directed to Dominic, so I'll allow him to answer it, which is, why is consistency a value? You obviously, to interpret what he might be saying, you could have a consistent application of very bad principles. So might it be the case that consistency is good in some contexts and not others? So, Richard, why should we aim for consensus?
Well, I suppose I'm not necessarily entering a plea for consensus, and I think Jonathan's right to detect that we're not going to get it on the deeply contested ethical questions. But I would enter a plea for consistency, and Mark alluded earlier, at least to the first half of Aristotle's observation around formal justice, and that gives you a reason for thinking consistency matters. You should treat equals equally. But of course, the second part, and this is the real head scratcher for me, is and unequals should be treated unequally. And I think there will be pertinent differences between individual patients. For example, Dom referred to some relevant considerations earlier, comorbidities, age, and so on. But I think the challenge around the guidance field is also around how much you need to tailor to particular regions, settings, contexts, groups, and so on. And I think that's where the real challenge lies. Now, we know in the academic research field, there are ways of gathering views and trying to bring them into balance. There are methodologies, so-called empirical bioethics, that tries to hear from the breadth of stakeholders and still navigate a course that is broadly respectful. I suppose a minimum bottom line, one of my big themes was really that respect element, ensuring that we at least hear the divergence of opinion, even if we're not going to resolve and get everyone in agreement. I'm tempted to say Brexit vote, but I won't. I'll just mute and hand over to Dom.
And thanks. So Richard's already partly answered the question about consistency. So I think consistency is a meta-ethical value. Consistency doesn't mean that we're acting ethically, but the flip side of it is that where we are being inconsistent, that's almost always a sign that there's something ethically worrying going on. Now, you might say, look, if you look underneath, there is a justification for the inconsistency. So there's an ethical justification. And then that's not inconsistency. It's a different decision, but it's consistency in terms of ethical principles. I think the challenge of the lack of guidance was that it looked highly likely that there would be inconsistent decision making. And I think that the Times report suggests that there was indeed inconsistent decision making. And that's because everybody was trying to make decisions on the run in the absence of clear national guidance. Jonathan also pointed to this question about whether some guidance might be more likely to generate consistency or consistency in different ways. And as I pointed to, you can, at the SILA end of the guideline spectrum, you can get very consistent guidelines by making very simplistic rules. And I think what Mark has pointed to is a criticism of guidance that tries to make complex decisions too simple, that reduces them, for example, to technical criteria that says, look, if you've got this particular illness severity score, you get into ICU, and if you have this sort of illness severity score, you don't, and fails to embrace the significant ethical complexity.
Thank you. And I think there's a nice question just come in from Kevin Ives, which I'm going to put to Katie for comment, and then others if they want to, which is essentially a version of the Skilla and Charybdis dilemma that Dom raised, was if you had very rigid national guidance which left doctors no freedom to make any particular decision, then it would absolve them from the stress of making decisions. On the other hand, what role would there still be for doctors to make their own input? And the comment is made, most doctors don't like being told what to do. So are there dangers in rigid national guidance that simply leave no space for discretion on the part of those who are actually on the front line?
Right. Yeah. Hi, Kevin. I saw that. Very interesting. I suppose so. It's absolute rigidity is never great, but a very broad discretion is going to lead to inconsistency that may be highly undesirable looked at from the patient perspective. I understand doctors don't like being told what to do. That might be part of the problem as to why we don't have a national guideline that one might think would be in the interest of patients. Perhaps patients might like it if doctors were told what to do a little bit more. I think these things are probably always somewhere in the middle. I've been sort of thinking about this quite a lot. Emma and I are both involved at the moment in different capacities in the infected blood inquiry, which is looking into the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS, when contaminated blood was given to large numbers of people. And I act for the Haemophilia Society. And that was, so if you were a haemophiliac, that was a pandemic local to that community that simply wiped out a very large number of haemophiliac people. And we've heard a massive amount of evidence from clinicians talking about treating people in the 1970s, particularly in the 1980s when the AIDS crisis struck, and a lot of haemophiliacs were unknowingly affected by the virus they didn't even have a name for then, called HIV. You can imagine how fascinating it is looking into this in the middle of a pandemic with a new virus that we don't know anything about either. And there's been a lot of talk about how jealously doctors guard their right to exercise skill and judgment, that they will treat their patients as they see the best interest of their patients to be. And one of the effects of that was that there came a new product on the market. It was available in the States, but not available here, that was supposed to have the ability to kill the HIV virus by heat treating the blood products, the factor coagulation products that were available in the US. And it wasn't available here. And some doctors made a decision to import it and get it specially for their patients, and some didn't. Now, whether that would have actually made a difference, I don't know, but imagine it would have done. Well, you know, should that be left to individuals' discretions? From the patient's point of view, they want to know what's the safest and can we all have it, please? From the doctors, they don't want to be told what products they can and can't prescribe. That'll be up to them, thank you very much. So it's quite difficult. I'm interested in consistency of process versus consistency of outcome. And I'm interested in Dominic's response, which is if you have an inconsistent outcome, then that's going to make you think about the fairness of the process. Going back to NICE and the legal challenge that there was to its original guidance on behalf of people who would have scored very badly on their frailty score because they had a learning disability or cerebral palsy or that nature. Of course, we wouldn't want an outcome that consistently led to the death of adults with cerebral palsy. On the other hand, would we want it left to doctors' discretion as to whether to provide the ventilator to the 75-year-old who didn't have cerebral palsy and take it off the 21-year-old who did? I think you want both, don't you? Consistency of process and consistency of outcome. Not sure if that answers the question. Ruminations rather than answers.
That's great. I'm actually, given time, going to leave the last word to Mark, actually, because I heard him as defending something like a principle of subsidiarity, namely let's devolve down to those local decision-making processes and ensure there what one gets is consistency of process. So there's a rather nice question that's come in from Perta saying that when you look at CECs and how they operated and have operated during the pandemic, doctors really did want clear guidance during the first wave as to how they should act and what was appropriate guidance to act by. So I wonder, Mark, if that's consistent with what you've said, or you want to respond.
Yeah, thanks, David. So I mean, one of the obvious answers for why we want guidance is because doctors want it. I mean, I think, and I take that point very seriously. I mean, and the route through clinical ethics committees, you know, that's sort of one way of going. But I think once we get the focus down, if the focus is down on how particular trusts were making decisions and a cry from that level for help, then those questions about what the right kind of help is becomes important, and to make sure that it's not making it easier kind of help, but giving assistance. And Katie's point there about leaving it alone, leaving it to the lone clinician, seems both to be not supportive of that, but also problematic for patients and for worries about getting it wrong. But I don't think that means we necessarily need to go all the way up and determine it from the top. I think there needs to be variety, and there's some variety and variation is okay. As I said, so long as it's the right kind of guidance, national guidance would be helpful. But I don't think it necessarily means that we undermine that point.
Thanks very much, Mark. And I'm aware others want to still contribute. I'm very aware of the time that we want to keep to. So I'm going to pull things to a close. I wouldn't want us to leave without noting two themes that have been addressed here. One is the need for clear public engagement and for the creation of a public space where we can have a discussion of ethical issues, and the absence of that within the UK, where science alone seems to lead. And the second was the question of preparedness. There seems to have been a degree of preparedness for in terms of resources, very little ethical preparedness for what was coming, and therefore the ability to have a sustained national debate. And that's something that the project Emma and I are involved in will continue. Just to let you all know that the next webinar is on December the 16th at 1 o'clock. It will look at the role of clinical ethics committees in the pandemic, and our lineup there is Ronan Gillen, Anne-Marie Slather from UKCEN, Peter Colson-Smith, who's here today, and Dame Susie Leather, who's involved in the Devon ethical framework. So all of you who've attended today are more than welcome to attend that next webinar, and I hope you register. So for now, can I thank very much indeed Don, Katie, Mark, and Richard for an extraordinarily rich and fascinating discussion, which helps Emma and I plan for the next webinars and for our final conference. Thank you very much indeed, and have a safe and healthy remainder of the pandemic. Bye now.